Royal news has captured attention once again, and this time the spotlight falls on one of the most beloved young members of the royal family, Prince Louis. The young prince has a way of charming people wherever he goes, often stealing the show with his natural innocence and joyful personality. Once again, he found himself at the center of attention, capturing hearts in a moment that began sweetly but soon turned into something no one in the room could have expected. What started as a warm and tender royal moment slowly unfolded into a scene filled with emotion, courage, and an unforgettable display of quiet strength. Little Prince Louis sat nervously at a piano, his cheeks slightly flushed and his small fingers trembling as he prepared to play. It was a simple performance, the kind of moment that should have been met with nothing but encouragement and smiles. But when a world-famous pianist unexpectedly let out a cruel laugh, loud enough for several people to hear, the entire atmosphere shifted. The room seemed to freeze, conversations faded, and while most people didn't fully register what had just happened, one person had heard every word: Princess Charlotte. Charlotte was watching carefully, and what she chose to do next would leave the entire room stunned. The gathering itself had begun peacefully, far removed from the usual grandeur and formality that often surrounds royal events. Instead of elaborate ceremony or public spectacle, the setting felt intimate and relaxed. Guests spoke softly in small groups, their conversations blending with quiet laughter that drifted gently through the room. For a brief moment, the royal family appeared free from the intense public scrutiny that often follows them. The atmosphere felt personal and warm, almost like a family gathering rather than a formal royal occasion. Friends, relatives, and guests mingled comfortably, dressed elegantly yet casually enough to create a sense of ease. It was one of those rare moments when the royal family seemed less like symbols of tradition and more like a normal family sharing time together. Among the youngest guests present was Prince Louis. You could immediately tell he was one of the younger children, not because of mischief or restless behavior, but because of how sincerely he tried to do everything right. There was something touching about the way he approached the moment, with a mixture of nervousness, determination, and hope. At just 7 years old, Louis had only recently begun learning the piano. He was not preparing to perform a complicated piece or impress anyone with extraordinary talent. Instead, he had planned to play a small beginner's tune, a simple melody he had practiced for weeks at home. Yet to Louis, that simple song meant everything. Every afternoon he had sat patiently at the piano, repeating the same notes again and again. Some days he made mistakes, some days he improved just a little, but each day he returned to the keys with quiet determination. The small progress he made filled him with pride, and slowly he built the courage to play without help. Now he stood waiting for his moment. Dressed neatly in a navy blazer with polished shoes and carefully combed hair, Louis looked both proud and nervous at the same time. He kept glancing toward the piano, rubbing his hands together in the way children often do when they are trying to hide their anxiety. There was something fragile yet hopeful about him in that moment. Seated in the front row was Princess Charlotte. Though she was only 9 years old, Charlotte already carried herself with a calm confidence that made her seem far older than her years. She observed everything quietly. She noticed the tension in Louis's shoulders, the way he chewed gently on his lower lip, and the way he tried to appear brave despite the nerves building inside him. Charlotte did not draw attention to his anxiety. She did not tease him or fuss over him. Instead, she simply stayed present and supportive. Charlotte had always been steady in that way, quiet, observant, and fiercely protective of those she loved. At one point, Louis glanced toward her. Charlotte gave him a small nod and a gentle smile. That single gesture was enough to reassure him. Charlotte wore a soft blue dress with a white cardigan, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't say much, but her presence alone seemed to bring comfort. When she smiled at Louis, he stood a little straighter, gathering the courage he needed for what came next. Not long after, the guest of honor arrived. He was a famous pianist whose name was known in concert halls around the world. He had performed on grand stages in major cities and earned admiration for his extraordinary musical skill. Many people in the room respected him deeply, and some even whispered his name as he walked by. Dressed in a tailored black suit with polished shoes and slicked-back hair, he looked every bit the accomplished musician he was known to be. He greeted a few guests politely and shook hands with the organizers of the event. At first glance, he appeared friendly and professional. But as he scanned the room, something in his expression hinted at a different attitude. His eyes moved across the children present, pausing on each one as if silently judging them. Whenever he looked toward the young performers, his smile faded slightly. He stepped toward the piano and examined it briefly before folding his arms and stepping back. Several adults applauded his arrival, but few noticed the faint smirk that crossed his face. Charlotte noticed. She watched him carefully. Something about his demeanor felt wrong to her. She couldn't fully explain it, but her instincts told her to pay attention. Meanwhile, Louis was preparing for his moment. When his name was finally called, he slowly stood up from his chair. His heart began beating faster as he walked toward the piano, trying his best to remain calm. His footsteps made light tapping sounds against the floor, and soon all the chairs in the room were turned toward him. The room fell quiet. Louis climbed onto the piano bench, his legs dangling slightly above the floor. He took a deep breath and placed his small fingers on the keys. He remembered the advice his teacher had given him: sit straight, relax your shoulders, and keep going even if you make a mistake. His hands trembled slightly, but he began to play. The melody was simple and gentle, the type of beginner piece designed for young students. Louis had practiced it countless times at home after school. Sometimes he played it well and sometimes he stumbled through it, but he had never given up. As he played, a few notes sounded uneven. One or two keys were slightly off, and a couple of notes were so soft they were barely audible. But Louis kept going. He focused on the keys, determined to finish the piece no matter what. When the final note ended, he lifted his hands from the piano and looked around the room. For a brief moment there was silence. Then came polite applause. Guests smiled warmly, nodding in encouragement. Some whispered kind remarks to one another. Louis felt proud of himself. He had done it. But not everyone in the room shared that feeling. Standing near the corner was the famous pianist. He had watched the entire performance with his arms crossed and a blank expression on his face. As Louis finished playing, the man leaned toward someone beside him and quietly chuckled. "At least he's royalty," he said with a faint smirk. "He won't need to live off this." The comment was spoken softly, but it was still clear enough to be heard. Princess Charlotte heard every word. Her smile slowly disappeared as she turned her head toward the pianist, her eyes fixed on him, calm but intense. Then she looked back at Louis, who was walking toward her with a proud smile on his face. He had not heard the comment. He believed his performance had gone well. Charlotte leaned closer and said gently, "That was really lovely." Louis's face lit up. Reassured by her words, he reached for a cookie from a nearby plate and happily began eating it. But Charlotte's attention shifted back to the pianist. She had seen the smirk, heard the insult, and understood exactly what had happened. Something inside her changed in that moment. It was not fear or sadness, it was determination. She remained quiet, but she had already made a decision. A few moments later, Charlotte stood up from her seat and walked calmly across the room. Her steps were slow and steady, yet people began to notice. Conversations quieted as she approached the pianist. Stopping directly in front of him, Charlotte looked him straight in the eyes. "Thank you for coming today," she said politely. The pianist nodded slightly, "Of course." Then Charlotte continued, "I heard what you said about my brother." The man blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting such a direct response. "He's 7, Charlotte said calmly. "He played today because he wanted to try, that matters." The pianist shifted uncomfortably. "You were 7 once too," she continued. "You didn't play perfectly either, but someone gave you time, someone believed in you." Her voice never wavered. The pianist lowered his gaze, suddenly unable to respond. Charlotte gave a small nod, then quietly returned to her seat. Louis looked up at her with curiosity. "What did you say?" he asked with a grin. Charlotte smiled slightly and replied, "Nothing much, just being polite." The room slowly filled with conversation again, though many guests had clearly heard what she said. Several people glanced at Charlotte with admiration. She had defended her brother without raising her voice or creating a scene. Later in the afternoon, something even more remarkable happened. Charlotte was invited to say a few words about Louis's performance. She stood once again and addressed the room with calm confidence. "My brother worked very hard for today," she said. "He practices every morning before school, even when he's sleepy. Everyone starts somewhere. No one plays perfectly the first time, not even great musicians." Then, without another word, she walked to the piano and sat down. The room fell silent once again. Charlotte began to play. Her piece was short but beautifully performed. Each note was clear and controlled, her fingers moving effortlessly across the keys. When she finished, the room erupted into warm applause. But the applause wasn't only for her playing. It was for what she had shown: grace, courage, and loyalty. Later, the pianist quietly approached Louis. "You did well today," he said gently. "It takes courage to play in front of everyone." Then he handed Louis a folder of beginner music sheets. "I think I forgot what it feels like to start," he admitted. "Thank you for reminding me." Louis accepted the pages with wide eyes and a grateful smile. Charlotte watched from nearby before placing an arm around her brother's shoulder. "You did amazing," she whispered. Louis grinned brightly. "I think I want to practice again next week." Charlotte nodded. "I'll help you." In that small moment, something meaningful had shifted. What began as a simple performance had turned into a powerful lesson about kindness, courage, and standing up for others. Princess Charlotte hadn't raised her voice or made a scene, yet she had shown remarkable strength. And in doing so, she reminded everyone in that room that true leadership is not about authority or titles. It is about heart.